Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this Bright Blue online event where we're discussing, after the white paper, levers for levelling up. And we're doing that in partnership with Playersherbers. So really, levelling up is the overarching domestic policy agenda of this government. But of course, it's another regeneration initiative, and there's been lots of these initiatives since the late 1960s, all with different levels of success and funding. The white paper published earlier this year tried to articulate the distinctiveness of this regeneration initiative, which the government's calling levelling up. And it was described by Michael Gove and Andy Haldane, who co-authored that white paper, as a mission to unleash opportunity, prosperity and pride in places where for too long it has been held back. And the white paper talked about 6 capitals: physical, human, intangible, financial, social and institutional, which are needed to foster opportunity, prosperity and pride. And the government set out 12 missions to be achieved by 2030 across 4 key areas around economics, around boosting pay and productivity and living standards, around public services, driving opportunities and improvements in public services, social goals around restoring a sense of community and pride and belonging in these places, and fourthly, democratic goals, particularly around further devolution and empowering local leaders. And really, the white paper was about setting a cross-party, cross-government, cross-departmental challenge. The government obviously recently, in the Queen's speech, laid out the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which will provide more substance, and the Levelling Up Fund has now been in place for some time, although you may have seen in the papers today the Public Accounts Committee criticising the inadequate criteria and evaluation of the awards. The government is obviously now facing both political and economic difficulties, so we're now for levelling up, both politically and in policy terms. We at Bright Blue and with Playersherbers have been thinking about the role of different private, public and voluntary organisations, including housing associations, in delivering up, in levelling up and delivering that. What are the physical, economic, social, democratic regeneration that you need in these areas, and the role of different actors in ensuring it? And how do you make sure that levelling up is truly community-led, that people living in these communities are the ones shaping it? So we've got all of this to discuss, and we've got a brilliant expert panel to kick it off before we take questions from you watching live. And we have with us Robert Jenrick, MP, who is the former Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government and a Member of Parliament for Newark since 2014. We have the Right Honourable Damian Green, who's the current chair of the One Nation Conservative Caucus and former First Secretary of State, and has been Member of Parliament for Ashford since 2019. Anushka Asthana, who is the Deputy Political Editor at ITV. Angela Lockwood, who is the Chief Executive of North Star Housing Group. Alex Smith, who is Chief Executive of the Cares Family. Councillor Rob Waltham, who is the leader of the North Lincolnshire Council. For those of you who want to tweet, please do, using the hashtags #levellingup or #brightblue. And if you want, you can use the Twitter handles of Bright Blue, we are Bright Blue, and Playersherbers at Playersherbers. And if you want to ask questions, please do through Slido, and you can see that just below the YouTube screen that you're watching. The code for that is Bright Blue, but you don't really need the code to ask the question. But if you could tell us who you are and what your question is, I will then read that out to the panelists. So I'm going to ask Robert to kick us off with his 5 minutes. Over to you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for the invite to join you today. It's always a pleasure to join Bright Blue events, and this is a topic very close to my own heart, having been a Secretary of State, partially responsible for this policy in its early days. And as someone who was born in Wolverhampton, is, I guess, unashamedly provincial from the Midlands, now in Parliament representing a Midlands constituency made up of small towns. It feels to me this is an extremely important mission, not just for the Conservative Party, but for the whole country, that we take this forwards and we make a success of levelling up. I think you're right in your introduction to say that levelling up is just a new term to describe something that this country's been grappling with for the whole of my lifetime, if not since the Second World War. Boris Johnson, when he became leader of the party, gave the title levelling up to a policy which Theresa May would have described as industrial strategy, would have been described as the productivity plan by George Osborne and Sajid Javid when they were in position some time before, and has a long history in Labour and Conservative governments tracing back for decades. I think that means two things. Firstly, we have to have strategic patience and view this as a project of many years. We're not going to see the dramatic results that some would wish for immediately, and governments have to follow through on this, of all parties, irrespective of who is leader or who is in power. Secondly, I don't think we should place too much weight, therefore, on the white paper, because the white paper, although I think an interesting document, and I have a lot of time for Andy Haldane, its principal author, is just the latest in a long line of documents that are trying to put an intellectual basis behind a pretty fundamental issue that we face economically and socially as a country, which is that we are one of the most geographically unequal countries in Europe, if not of any major developed economy. I think it did alight on a couple of points which are really worth us now progressing rapidly with. One was the role of local government in devolution. And I've long been a proponent of devolution. I was able to take forward some of the devolution deals that we've seen in West Yorkshire and South Yorkshire. And I'd like to see more of those. I think that on balance, not in every case, but on balance, the mayors are a good addition to our democratic framework. And generally, though not always, but generally, local government is good at delivering public services, often better than central government. And I suspect whenever it comes, the analysis of the pandemic will show that the one area that performed consistently well in the British state was local government during that difficult period, and delivered good services at relatively good value for money. So the importance now of pushing forward with devolution seems very significant to me. Secondly, we're going to have to place, I think, a greater emphasis on education. At the moment, this has been a very heavily regeneration and town centre and civic pride focused initiative, and that's what I really took forward in my time as Secretary of State, because it's been driven primarily out of the Communities Department. But at the end of the day, this is about opportunity and ensuring that a child growing up in Wolverhampton has access to the same opportunities as one growing up in Westminster. You have to place education and skills absolutely at the heart of this. The third point I'd say is that the regeneration side is progressing. The funds are providing billions of pounds of resources, often to places that didn't receive very much in the past, small town Britain. But that's going to be very difficult as we enter into troubled economic times. And the economic backdrop, I think, is what we've really got to be concerned about now, and whether that really stalls levelling up in a meaningful sense for members of the public. And that brings us to the last opening point, which is that I think if there's a flaw of the white paper and the approach the government's taken latterly, is that this is quite a statist project. At the end of the day, you're not going to raise living standards and opportunity in places like those I represent unless you get more businesses, more entrepreneurs, more investment from the private sector into those places. And I think that needs to be our focus now. There is a role for the state in helping to enable that, but we've got to be focused on how we can lead this from a private sector perspective, because there will never be enough public sector money to do this job alone, and certainly not in the years ahead.
Great, thank you, Robert. That was very thoughtful, and I know you're very knowledgeable and passionate about this, particularly from your time as Secretary of State. Just one question from me, which is, you're right that this is very much a long-term project, and all the evidence I've seen from previous regeneration initiatives is that outcomes tend to accrue very much in the long term. And those outcomes, to be honest, are quite marginal. What seems to make more of a difference is the level of private sector, public sector investment in those areas, which you nodded to just towards the end of your speech. But thinking politically, obviously the missions in a Levelling Up white paper are all about what can you achieve by 2030. But is there any progress by the next election that the government can say, look, we know this is long term, but the government has started on this levelling up journey. Here is some examples of, or measurements of success. Do you think we can point to that?
Yes, I think we will be able to point to some things. Ironically, the policy which has had the most impact on the ground is one of the more contentious ones, which was the first thing we did, which was the Towns Fund, where we simply selected smaller towns across the country with higher levels of deprivation and offered them the opportunity to have £25 million of investment. That has moved quite quickly, and in those places, that work is now happening. I suspect by the time we reach the next general election, you'll see the product of that in most of those places. And because some of those places are not big cities or large boroughs like Tower Hamlets or Manchester, they tend to be Granthams and Newarks and small towns. They're not places that routinely receive that kind of funding or access to that potentially transformative investment. And so I think that will have an impact on the ground. I think more funding for education will help as well. And remember that a relatively early thing that the government did was to increase the per pupil funding for schools, and that will make a big difference, particularly in some of the types of places we're looking to level up. The community that Rob represents, for example, in parts of Lincolnshire where funding per pupil was quite low, that will help. But I think the government does face a danger that it will have relatively little to show. And although I'm a passionate supporter of devolution, I don't think it's something that in the short term wins you votes. Nobody in my constituency is going to celebrate the fact that there may be an elected mayor in Nottinghamshire by the time of the next general election. They might be grateful in years to come if that happens to elect somebody of high caliber, like Andy Street or an Andy Burnham, who then leads forward investment and transformation in that community. But that will come much further down the line. And although I think that placing these targets in law is a perfectly sensible thing to do, I doubt there are many members of parliament that could name what these targets are, and there will be almost no members of the public that will be able to name them. So politically, that will achieve very little. What people want to see is delivery on the ground in their own communities, and the government really now has 2 years to focus relentlessly on that. And I think that's a big task, and they need to be addressing that with a greater sense of urgency than you see today.
Great, thank you, Robert. And my parents live in your constituency, and I can definitely share your thoughts that devolution is not the sort of most pressing thing that they're thinking about and their friends. Right, Damian, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ryan. It's always a pleasure to do Bright Blue events. And I'm conscious that when you have 6 speakers, the slight danger is, particularly for those who are numbers 5 and 6, that everyone says the same thing. So I'm going to try and go slightly off-piste in a way. In that levelling up covers a multitude of issues, as you set out in the intro. And today, as it happens, is very timely. We are discussing the second reading of the bill. So we've already gone beyond the white paper. We have legislation in front of Parliament today. And I'm struck that literally this morning, since I sat down at this computer, I've had 2 last-minute bits of lobbying about the bill. One from a cycling organisation saying it's really important that all the new regeneration activity that happens is cycle friendly and anti-car, basically. And another from the Country Landowners Association saying that the important thing is rural proofing, and that actually there's an 18% productivity gap between rural Britain and urban Britain, and it's actually reducing that productivity gap is the way to level up for millions of people. And as I thought Rob set out very well, that leveling up as a concept is actually a rebadging of a previous concept which all governments have grappled with, which is how to spread wealth and opportunity. And the danger is it comes to mean everything to everyone. So although I suspect most people will want to talk about geographical leveling up, I want to talk about what is the most controversial part of this bill for Conservative MPs, which is the planning and housing aspect of it. Because they rolled up the planning bill into the levelling up bill, I think in an attempt to smuggle it through in the hope that nobody notices that this is what's going on. And as Rob knows to his cost, planning is hugely controversial on the Conservative benches, and I suspect on the Labour benches as well. And the reason I think this is very relevant to our discussion this morning is that it's not just individual areas that need levelling up. It is whole cohorts of society, and in this instance particularly, it is young people that need levelling up. Just as we have left behind areas, we are in danger of having a left behind generation, and there are a number of things that contribute to this. But one of the key things is access to housing in particular, and home ownership specifically. And the problem has always been that, candidly, regardless of who's sitting in the Secretary of State's chair, the Department for Local Government, under its various names and guises, has always believed that we don't build enough houses, and that the reason we don't build enough houses is terrible, NIMBY local authorities dragging their feet and not being willing to annoy their own people. And I think that analysis is wrong on both counts. First of all, just mathematically, we have a housing stock of roughly 30 million. So whether you build an extra 300,000 or an extra 350,000 a year makes minimal difference in terms of affordability of new housing. It's about 0.3% of the stock you're adding to it, and with any product, that amount of change is not going to make that much difference. So there are various measures that should be taken that would avoid having a left behind generation who stare gloomily at how their parents and grandparents have grown rich on the back of their housing wealth, to which they are never going to have access. One is an old row that has been going on for a long time, where developers don't build on the plots they've got planning permission for. The CPRE has estimated, I know this is contested, but it's the best figure anyone's come up with, that there are about 1 million homes with planning permission that have not been built. And the government could set itself hugely ambitious targets and could actually meet them for the rest of this parliament without granting a single extra planning permission, and therefore having any controversy. So actually gripping developers and making them develop is one of the ways of addressing the numbers issue. And secondly, and this would be even more controversial, I suspect, is that if you want home ownership, which I do, and which I think more to the point, consistently 70% of people want to end up as homeowners, particularly young people. That's what they want. You need to shift the advantage away from big rental companies that buy up newly built homes and particularly flats, and just use them all for rental. And I can only best illustrate that from my own constituency example, where actually we've had a council that has taken a lot of political flack for building lots of homes, but nevertheless, I just observe that they build blocks of flats in the centre of Ashford, and they just get bought by big, often overseas investment companies to all for rental. So you have a situation where in a prosperous part of the country, the average wage in my constituency is 30,000. The average house price is 300,000. Nobody can get on the housing ladder with the average wage from Ashford, in Ashford. This is clearly wrong. Meanwhile, they are paying more than they would be paying in a mortgage to rent a flat, which, we have lots of nice shiny new flats, but they're largely owned by Chinese investment companies. So some kind of change in the system is needed to allow a sort of normal flow of hardworking people who've got steady jobs and doing everything they would want to do, but they are being denied the opportunities that my generation, and indeed a generation below, would regard sort of almost as their birthright if they do the right thing. So, why is this relevant to levelling up? Because I think it is, if levelling up is going to be successful, it has to happen in all parts of the country. As I say, even in a prosperous area like mine, we get levelling up funds because there are pockets of deprivation, and more to the point, there are pockets of opportunity which we can spread. But also, all over the country, we are in danger of leaving behind a whole generation. And if we do that, I bet it will be worse in the areas that are themselves disadvantaged. And even if that assertion is not always true, it is absolutely the case that if you have a generation that thinks that the system is not providing them with the opportunity to get what they want, then you have a really serious long-term effect on people's consent to democratic politics. So I think this is one of the most urgent parts of the levelling up agenda. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Damian. And very good to have that different perspective. Bright Blue is just about to start a project actually looking at the planning system, and as the levelling up bill makes its way through Parliament, and thinking about how you can balance those two goals. One is the socioeconomic goals of increased home ownership, more young people being able to afford homes, and then the environmental goals around ensuring that our housing supply is climate friendly and is improving biodiversity. So sort of building on the net gain principle, biodiversity net gain principle. So we'll be trying to come up with technocratic solutions that resolve both of those aims. So watch out for that. Damian, question for me is, you seem to be suggesting, and I think there's a growing consensus on this, which is in some parts of the country, supply is definitely an issue, but actually a lot of what's wrong with the housing market is distributional, and the distribution of the existing housing stock. And I'm interested, a lot of attention is always on the supply side, but thinking about demand side issues as well, which is that, many decades ago, a lot of people were able to get mortgages on quite generous terms, including it could be interest only. The amount that they could borrow relative to the salary was relatively high, but particularly since the financial crisis, that has the terms for first-time buyers have become a lot stricter. And do you think the government may move on that a little bit, thinking about how they can encourage banks to improve their mortgage terms so that essentially first-time buyers can loan more to afford quite expensive homes?
I think they should, but I think we should be realistic about that and think it's going to have to be backed by some kind of guarantee, because the one thing we can be sure of is that through the 2020s, interest rates are going to be higher than they have been through the 2010s. And so, mortgages will be more expensive and but there may well be interest rate spikes over the next few years. And what you don't want is to lure people in with 100% mortgages with no backing, and then they suddenly find they can't meet the repayments with all the effects that we saw in the 1990s recession. So let's learn from that. And not go into that again, but yes, I do think that. But I think make the point about its demand as well as supply. So yes, I would help, particularly first-time buyers. But also there are other things we could do on the supply side without just maniacally building more and more houses everywhere. For example, there is no incentive for older people to move out of the big family home and downsize into something as good, but just smaller, because that's what they need. We just don't build enough of that type of housing here. If you had that type of incentive, then you would free up the housing market. You would have fewer, if you like, under-occupied houses, where people just stay in their family home for sentimental reasons as well as economic reasons, but you're sitting in a place you love, they've got all your memories in it, and it's going up in value every year. It's the best investment you've ever made. Why would you ever move? Well, one of the things you can do about that is to give them somewhere to move into that will make their life easier, that you can say, okay, when we may get older and frailer, actually, this will be a better house to live in. But it's got to be top of the range, because if it's retirement housing, as it were, becomes slightly second-rate housing that people have to move into, then the generation that has the choice, because they've lived in houses for 25 years which have risen in value, and therefore they can afford something good, need to have something good. And we build far less of that type of housing in this country than we do in comparable countries around the world. So that in itself would free up the supply side.
Great. And often talk about stamp duty being a block for movement within the housing market. Of course, the Treasury is quite keen on stamp duty, not least because of the revenue that it raises, but also compared to alternatives like a proportional property tax, land value tax, it is in a way voluntary. You only pay it if you move, whereas those other measures would apply regardless. So perhaps there's some attraction to stamp duty in that way. Okay, let's now go to the politics of all of this and bring in Anushka, which is, the government really, the Boris Johnson's government, has been quite unlucky in terms of COVID hit, then the war in Eastern Europe, and it's wanted to focus on levelling up, but hasn't. So hasn't been able to as much as it would have liked. So just interested in your thoughts on where levelling up is now, what the potential of levelling up is for a Conservative government, and how much room for manoeuvre Boris actually has on this agenda.
I was thinking recently as a political journalist, obviously we spend a lot of time on the daily controversial treadmill, and it's quite hard to get past that. But if you're looking forward and thinking, how do you hold this government to account? It has to be largely on levelling up, because it is the biggest promise that they have made. And it is an enormous promise. And it brings difficulties for us as journalists. And I'll just tell you why. Take the white paper, for instance. It's obviously a good document, right? It's got lots of good ideas in. It's about trying to spread opportunity across the country. Nobody could say that's a bad thing. But it's like this kind of vast document that I almost think of it, it's almost like spaghetti in your hands. Like, just to give you an example of some of the things in there, like schools, skills, NHS, universal credit, crime, immigration, culture, the green industrial revolution, housing, of course, devolution. Like, how as a journalist do you take from that a definition of levelling up and then hold the government to account on it? I'll tell you where I get to with that, but I think it makes it a very difficult kind of thing to target and to show that you have made progress in. Particularly some of those areas are hard to do that in. I think credit to the government for focusing on skills. Very, very hard to show the kind of achievements that you would need to make that into a kind of political story in a way. Although I know that Nadhim Zahawi wants to. Now, there's clearly is stuff happening, right, which doesn't get much press because there's so much press on other things like confidence votes, etc. But, the second reading is happening today, I think, I'm right? So they're going to put these missions in law. I think Robert's probably right. Would any of the public even know that there are missions? I mean, probably right now they're not thinking about that. But it is a good thing, although I see the targets can be changed, which if you are cynical, doesn't necessarily look like a positive thing. They've also done these regeneration zones in places like Blackpool. I was thinking as a journalist, Blackpool's a really interesting place to lots of people in government. Maybe we should be going there and doing a much deeper dive in Blackpool. But because it's so vast, it's not all about what Michael Gove does and what Neil O'Brien does. It's about what every single government department does. And so if you start looking around those government departments, then I think I do get a little bit more skeptical about what I'm seeing. So education, absolutely at the heart of it. And education white paper, quite a good thing, but it is totally a national thing, right? The levelling up side of education was supposed to be educational, what were they called? Opportunity zones or something. I might be wrong, but I don't think they've announced any of those yet. Trains. The government get furious at us when we say you've cut the amount you're spending on trains to 96 billion. And they say 96 billion is a huge number. It is a huge number, but the southern part of the projects are all going ahead as planned. So overall, on trains, you're rebalancing to the south. So it becomes hard then to argue that on public transport, which is probably absolutely key to levelling up, that there is a shift in one direction. Culture, I mean, I got this figure from Henry Morrison, so you tell me, I think it was him who told it me, that, you know, on culture, Nadine Dorries rightly says levelling up has to be at the heart of everything, but Bradford, as the city of culture, is getting 275,000. Hull, when George Osborne was Chancellor, got 13 million. A city of culture. So as a journalist, you're thinking, okay, these are the sort of areas where I'm starting to question, is the white paper actually going to be something that we see in practice? Obviously, there's stuff as well about shared prosperity funds not matching EU funds. The levelling up funds that you guys have talked about, again, they seem like a really good thing. They seem really interesting, but it feels quite centralised for a policy which presumably has to focus very heavily on devolution. There are mutterings in government, you guys will know this better than me, that Rishi Sunak isn't giving the money that people want for all these different areas. We'll see. I mean, to me, the definition of levelling up, from what I've read, from both sides, from Labour, from the Tories, it's about people like me in a way. Like, I grew up in Stalybridge in the north, and for opportunity, I moved to the south. And it's about saying, how can I have that opportunity in the north? I think the government wants that, right? I think the government absolutely believes in all of this, but I think some of the language chimes against it. So the whole Jacob Rees-Mogg stuff about flexible working, I think really, really clashes with levelling up. You know, although there are jobs in hospitals or as a train worker or in supermarkets that are the same the countrywide, there are lots of jobs which are unequal and are more in the southeast, and that's one of the problems that we've got. It's one of the reasons someone like me moved from Stalybridge. When we had people working from home during the pandemic, we had a team that was based in Newcastle, Liverpool, Glasgow and Leicester, and it massively improved our output. I just thought, you know, we did really great stuff in places like Hartlepool that we wouldn't have been able to do as well if our teams had all been based in one place in the southeast. So I think there's a huge opportunity on levelling up around flexible working post-pandemic, and I feel like this government doesn't feel like it's going to seize that, although I'm told that internally some people have told Jacob Rees-Mogg they don't agree with him on what he's saying there. Just finally, I would say biggest thing feels to me devolution. Like, it's not sexy. I totally agree with you. It's not going to win you votes, but ultimately, if you look around the country, it is where you see big changes. And I think Labour are coming forward with something very big on this with Gordon Brown, and I think that's going to make it a very politically difficult area for both sides. And beyond that, it's just getting this through all the other noise in politics, which right now feels very, very difficult to do.
Interesting stuff. Thank you, Anushka. That was really useful, and a chance for me to promote another Bright Blue thing, which I always do in these events, which is we did produce a report earlier in this year around home working and both the benefits and challenges of that, which were experienced during the pandemic. So please do check out our website for that. But it does bring benefits and challenges, and you've spoken about some of the benefits, which I very much agree with. And it seems that people are criticising Jacob Rees-Mogg internally, but also publicly as well. So let's move now swiftly on to Angela, and really sort of the role on the ground of different community actors, including housing associations, and how they can be a key partner in helping the government to achieve their levelling up missions.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just for the audience, Playersherbers is a national network of place-based housing organisations who collaborate, or change makers, and we policy shapers, mainly housing associations, and very importantly, we are characterised, I think, by a strong commitment to shaping places where people can thrive. And we go well beyond bricks and mortar. And we also have very strong connections to and really good understanding of communities. So I'm unashamedly going to talk about what's going on the ground and what I think housing associations can do to help with levelling up going forward. And I'm a battle-hardened regen person, I'm afraid, and I know all the acronyms attached to regen. So I'm really pleased that levelling up is not an acronym. So housing associations, I mean, we've been around for decades. My organisation, I'm based in the Northeast. I'm based in Teesside in the combined authority area, and my organisation's been around for around 50 years. And I would honestly argue that there are no better organisations who understand communities, because we're going nowhere. Have been around, we're totally committed to what we do. We also add 11 billion to the national economy, which is very significant. We also have a lot of experience, and we know for sure that temporary funding won't drive sustainable revival in places that have been losing momentum since the 1970s. We talk about those areas that are held back. Most housing associations work with those communities and those areas that are held back and have been for an awful long time. Because of years of underinvestment and focus, some areas, I would argue, are so left behind that we really do need speedy housing and community interventions that really tackle the issues head on in a way that we've perhaps not done before. I mean, the truth is that old solutions will not resolve new problems. We have the experience of the past, but actually the territory has shifted and the old maps are not working anymore. When I look at where I operate in Middlesbrough, for instance, I'm confronted with, in my areas that I operate in, child poverty levels of 60% in some of those wards, and these levels are growing. And you know you're in trouble when the headmaster of the school says the lucky ones are those who are getting free school meals. So I would say, for sure, overly complex policies and long-term planning are not going to help the immediate issues of acute destitution. And I use that word carefully, but I do think that's what we're facing. So if I think about the child poverty, for instance, in Middlesbrough, half of it is from working families. Many of the families that we are reaching out to and are working with are actually in survival mode. And we know that when they're in this mode, they're just trying to get through the day with absolutely no ability to plan. And even the end of the week is a long time away. And if we really want to level up, we have to face what's going on out there, because we have to get beyond that, especially if we want to narrow the inequality gap. Because if we're not careful, this increase in polarisation will be a barrier to levelling up. And I'm in the Northeast and I really welcome the levelling up agenda. I'm on a town deal funding board. I mean, I'm really pleased that Darlington's got the Treasury coming in, and I work very closely with the combined authority, and all of that is to be welcomed. However, this is what's going on in the communities that the Playersherbers organisations operate in. And I also experience communities that have been done to for too long, top down. So as much devolution as possible is to be welcomed, because the communities I work with have had a lot of broken promises, and hope for a better life has all but evaporated. And we are stuck in a bit of a cycle here. However, I am aware that government intends to give more attention to spatial disparities, which is just brilliant. And we need to take this opportunity and really make it work for us in the communities that we're operating in. We also have to accept that we have to work with communities, I think, in a completely different way to what we've done before. We need to link them to better paid jobs. We need to link them to skills in a way that we've not done before, and education. We also have to accept that regeneration at scale has its place. And we have to do something immediately, I would suggest, to tackle the cost of living crisis. Otherwise, any levelling up is going to be top down. So communities and strong civic institutions are required, really, to drive on the levelling up agenda. I would say, and I've been in housing an awful long time, and I've been a Playersherbers member for an awful long time, that Playersherbers organisations are very, very close to communities. We understand the needs, we have very strong relationships with them, we have a lot of knowledge and skills, and to be honest, we know a lot about what is required, not everything, but we do know how to get into meaningful dialogue. Many of us during the pandemic scaled up our attention to communities, our investment in communities, and we're using this experience to continue building the resilience in those areas. I would say that place-based housing associations are the partners that can really make a difference on the ground. But you know what? They're often overlooked, or they're often misunderstood. And for an awful long time, we've all invested in our communities, not just in bricks and mortar, but actually in the health and well-being of the people who live in our property, because we are social purpose organisations. And this includes emergency help when things are rough and tough, and also programmes to match local people to job opportunities, and much more than that. More importantly, we know how to work with the strengths of communities. We go in it from a strength-based approach, and we don't do things too. The massive strength about place-based housing associations are that they're rooted in the communities. We are rooted in the areas that have the greatest need of support. And what an invaluable resource that must be for government and for local institutions. The knowledge that we have is second to none. We have trust in relationships. We have a real ability to listen, to understand, and we have a great weather check on data. So we know what's going on in terms of crime and social disorder. We know what's going on in terms of unemployment issues. We're in it for the long term, you see. That's why we don't just build and run, we're there. And my organisation, for instance, has been there for 50 years. So where does this take us? I don't want anyone to forget the absolute invaluable role that housing associations can make in the levelling up agenda on the ground. We highly value partnerships. We know how to make them work. But we also need to be very mindful that research after research has told us that local tailored approaches, working with people, creates much more sustainable solutions. And this should not be underestimated, which is good because it links to devolution. So what have we got to offer? Well, we kind of want to do more. Much of the work we do currently is from our own funding, which is under increasing pressure. We already invest in employment initiatives, training and development. We provide access to welfare and debt advice, and we have extensive involvement activity. But we need more. We really do need more. And often where there is funding, housing associations are restricted by short-termism. We need long-term funding to make a difference. It's also very inconsistent, and often we can't even access public funding. So we're reliable, we're concerned, we're committed partners. We have many of the answers. We know our communities better than anyone, and we need to have a major strategic role in levelling up, because I honestly think if we collaborate properly across the sectors, together, we stand a chance of making a difference.
Great stuff. Thank you, Angela. Talking there about the kind of destitution we're now facing, the ensuring that levelling up is not about something being done to communities, but them leading it. And of course, the role of housing associations. And also what more housing associations could do if they had the right support and resources. One question I had for you was that the government, I think this week, will be announcing an extension of right to buy to housing association tenants, which has been, since Cameron was Prime Minister, a sort of ambition of the Conservative government. Do you think that's going to be helpful, the right approach?
Well, if you've got 4.2 million on the waiting list for social housing, and you've got getting up to 500,000 homeless people, with thousands of asylum seekers in hotel accommodation waiting for the applications to be processed, who will require more social housing, it seems almost beyond the pale to consider that we would sell off our current social housing, especially when we know from the recent pilots, which, to be fair, government evaluated, they told us that we couldn't replace on a one-to-one basis. So all we will see is a residualisation of a scarce resource. So we're just going to accelerate the housing issue and not help it in any way, shape or form. Housing associations are not opposed to home ownership in any way, shape or form, but this isn't the right solution to the acute housing problem that we've got.
Okay, Robert, I presume you have a different view to that, which is less sceptical.
I share some of those concerns. It's obvious that we need to build far more social houses. You saw that very vividly this summer, as you just heard from Angela, where you've got last summer, tens of thousands of people in hotels. And we created a scheme, Homes for Ukraine, partly because local councils just had nowhere to house people. So you had to reach out to members of the public and ask them to house them. That was a sort of vivid sign that social housing was full. And so we need to build some more. I do think that people misunderstand the economics of social housing, because 50% of the money for social housing or affordable housing comes from developer contributions. And so if you want more social houses being built, you need to build more market houses as well. unless you can persuade the government to put in tens of billions of pounds of more investment, which seems unlikely in the current fiscal position. On the right to buy, I think it's a good thing that people have a ladder so they can go into a home as a secure tenant, and then if their circumstances allow, have the opportunity to be able to purchase that home. And so if we can spread that opportunity, then I think that's generally a good thing. I do think it has to be done in such a way that the housing associations or local authorities can purchase new properties, so we don't see a diminution in the stock. And that is a very valid point that Angela makes. I would just say on the policy, there's a reason why it's faltered over the years. It's technically very difficult to implement. And when we did a pilot of it in the Midlands, take-up was much lower than people expected. There was an initial flurry of interest, but then when the reality sunk in, far fewer tenants actually came forwards and purchased the properties. And that's partially because the types of people in housing association stock these days is different to the types of people who are in council housing stock in the 70s and 80s. To get a housing association property, understandably, you have to be on a pretty modest income or on benefits on a very, very low income, in which case you're not often that well placed to purchase your own property. And so I wouldn't hold this up as a panacea that is likely to vastly increase levels of home ownership in this country. If it was rolled out across the whole country, I think you'd see some take up, but not a dramatic change. To me, and I always make this case, I think the most important thing is to increase the supply of homes, whether that be market homes or social housing. At the end of the day, that is the way to help people into secure housing, whether as renters or homeowners.
Great, thank you, Robert. Very, very interesting. Okay, let's move now to Alex. And you've been thinking a long time about the role of the civic sector. And Robert, in his introductory speech, talked about the Levelling Up white paper and the agenda feeling a bit status. So what's the role of the civic sector in levelling up?
Bright Blue for having me. So the Cares family that I run brings older and younger people together to reduce loneliness and build intergenerational solidarity, something that's already come up. I think Damian mentioned that. I've got a slightly different perspective from the other panelists and on levelling up in general, which is that the more even distribution of opportunity, prosperity and pride, which is how, Ryan, you introduced levelling up, isn't really about trains or housing or technology or top-down growth strategies or even kind of educational and skills funding per se. The power and powerlessness that shape modern Britain are held in place through something else entirely, which in my view is a ghettoization of relationships. So think about the backgrounds of people in positions of cultural and economic power. 74% of senior judges who interpret our laws went to private schools, 51% of leading journalists went to private schools, 2/3 of the cabinet went to private schools, almost identical proportions went to Oxbridge. And that's not just about schooling or the quality of the education that people have, it's about the support and the protection and the networks of opportunity and horizon and the pride and the belonging that you talked about, and the cultural cues that those schools afford to people in existing positions of privilege, access to internships, dress codes, speech, jargon, confidence, how people conduct themselves, including in interviews, for example. And on the other side of that coin, meanwhile, 39% of state school pupils say that they don't know a single person in a job that they themselves would like to do. And that proportion increases to 45% amongst those receiving free school meals. So the thing that's really going to level up Britain is what I call relational equity. More people knowing and supporting one another, particularly across different backgrounds and life experiences. and the more even distribution of relationships with kind of positive cultural and economic power, and a focus on social connection as a route to opportunity. And I think that is something that comes very strongly from civil society in general, to your point, Ryan. Luckily, there is a small reference to this, in the Levelling Up white paper, which is to a commitment to a community spaces and relationships strategy. There's about 4 bullet points in the Levelling Up white paper about this. What should this strategy look like in my view? Well, at the Cares family, we've seen what good relationships across difference look like, and we know how to build those relationships. And our research about what works tells us that there are kind of 5 key aspects that all civil society organizations, and indeed most individuals, can take forward in their own lives. Number 1, bring people together to share meaningful experiences, not just space. And that comes back to the point that this isn't just about physical infrastructure, this is about social infrastructure. Number 2, enable equal status interactions between people from different walks of life, not service provision where one person is a volunteer and the other person a receiver necessarily, but equal status relationships. Number 3, nurture people's agency to improve their own lives and the lives of others. That can happen through top-down devolution to local places, but it can also happen from the bottom up through civil society organizations and individual neighborliness. Number 4, cultivate a shared sense of belonging within and to a specific place, which I think, again, civil society organizations are very good at and government is very bad at. And number 5, provide space for friendship and view that as a core purpose. So again, people, how do we all make friends in our lives? It's through sharing experience, it's through sharing meaning, it's through sharing conversations. It's not just the Cares family that holds these principles as kind of core to expanding power and opportunity through relationships. There is a new wave of civic institutions that has arisen in recent years that all instinctively sing from this same hymn sheet. Good Gym, for example, brings older and younger people together through exercise. Girl Dreamer helps young women of colour to gain confidence and power through relationships so that they can succeed in the corporate world. Little Village is expanding kind of social solidarity across class differences, not just within social strata, through a national network of baby banks. And all of these kind of new connecting institutions introduce people to other people who are not like them, right? And in doing so, that creates often lasting relationships that distribute power over a long period of time. So my last point, I suppose, is, this is not radical stuff, I don't think. I use the term relational equity, which could make it sound potentially radical, but it's actually really mainstream and quite popular. In a poll last year that the Cares family did with Power to Change, 76% of adults said that investing in social infrastructure should be as much of a priority for the government as investing in physical infrastructure. So in answer to the question, what's next for levelling up? It's not just about trains or tech or growth strategy, certainly not at all costs. Government, I think, needs to work with civil society in general to make sure that we all collectively prioritise relationships, including in the national narrative that comes from politicians and the media. And this is a kind of generational, it's going to take 20, 25 years to change the culture so that we do become more neighbourly, a bit less British, a bit less kind of stiff upper lipped about how we interact with one another. I'll finish on my favourite stat, which is that 72% of adults in the UK think that knowing their neighbours is important, and 73% say that they don't know their neighbours themselves. We need entirely to move away from that equanimity that we can value something like neighbourliness and community, but do nothing particularly to nurture it, right? And so that's my key message, I suppose, that neighbourliness and community are one of the strongest routes to levelling up in society.
Great stuff. Thank you, Alex. Very eloquent. And you kept on time, unlike the other speakers. So extra brownie points for that. And we at Bright Blue have done a lot of thinking around the importance of strong and diverse social networks for people's outcomes. And there's lots of evidence now that if you have those strong and diverse relationships, you're less likely to live in poverty. And you're also, from the US, the Equality of Opportunity Project there has shown that you're more likely to experience social mobility. So we've been doing a lot of thinking about how can you create institutions in local communities which bring people together, particularly people from different backgrounds. And I think a Conservative government, which has always emphasised the importance of institutions, should be thinking about, they've had the National Citizens Service as a kind of new institution for young people, are there other new institutions they can plant in these areas to bring people together, to improve, as you say, their social capital? So let's now move to local government, and we've tried to have an array of voices on this panel from different backgrounds. And Anushka said that, you know, devolution is not particularly sexy, so it's your job, Rob, to bring devolution back to being sexy. So over to you.
There's a thought, bringing sexy back in local government. Oh, well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. And also, it's a great pleasure to follow up on a number of really respected speakers. I, in North Lincolnshire, I have a council in which we have a steelworks, a port, we have a refinery, lots of heavy industry. So for us, our workforce has been well placed in some quite, you know, significantly what people would probably in other areas of the country say lots of dirty jobs, which probably lots of people don't always want to do, but they're good, honest jobs that people have made a really good living. I'm the son of a steel worker and an auxiliary nurse. I grew up in a council estate. I know exactly what it's like to walk around that estate. I still represent the area and the estate that I grew up in, and I still see generations of families that still live there, that know me as the kid who went to college that actually was university, but they still think it's all about, you know, going on and taking exams and going and doing something better. So I think there is evidence over years of lots of regeneration where people have seen a connect between what the ambition was in government and how that money is spent. But I absolutely support the previous speaker. If people are not big in regeneration and it becomes about big system thinking, then frankly people will always stay down, which is why when previous speakers say it shouldn't be an important agenda to be able to own your own home, whether that's a connect via a council house, which my family did, that rose them out of the instability sometimes that letting can bring, but also it brings a great deal in terms of shaping a place and encouraging people to connect to that. I've just spent 12 months of my life on the expert panel for the changes to the children's social care agenda, which was a big report that Josh McAllister published that we've worked on government with for the last 18 months, 12 months time. So in that time, we examined what basically stimulates the background to over 1 million challenged children and families that end up in a care system that leads to family breakdown, that leads to great governmental cost, which leads to some real significant failure for some families that then have to try and reconnect sometimes with relationships and society and encouraging them to become economically active, which is they're so far away from when that relationship has broken down and they've ended up with children's in the social care system, which is clearly not a better outcome or anything that we would conceive as being a positive intervention. So I think, first of all, when you think about levelling up, you have to think about the people that we're seeking to connect to. And so from my council perspective, we're very people focused. We want to know what we can do to transform the lives of the individuals that live in our area. And of course, I shamelessly pitch for local government because it is here that we are at the local, and Robert Jenrick, who thankfully gave us a town deal that's already starting to transform some of the place initiatives in Scunthorpe, which is an area that's had some real challenge around deprivation. So I'll always be grateful to Robert for helping us with that. But we connect with people by making sure they have stability, usually around 3 factors. First of all, that they have a home that's a stable tenancy or a place that they can own, because that is a significant disruptor in someone's life if they don't have a place to lay their head at the end of the day and to be able to call their own, whatever the tenure comes from. We talk really around stability around a stable social life. That could be as simple as making sure that someone's got a friend, or they can have good relationships with people in the community, even if it's just saying hello to someone and saying hello back to you as you walk down the street. And then I think the third thing that we talk about connecting in terms of success is that in relation to a career, not just a job, but something that you feel that you're adding value to, that you're developing yourself as an individual, and that you can work in a place which values you and gets to value the contribution that you make. And I think there's been really positive interventions from living wage, and also from us taxpayers keeping more of your wages by raising the personal allowances. It means that people at the lower wage end have been able to keep more of their money, and also use universal credit as a top up, and on all some of the other amazing interventions. Because I think this has been a significant and a really interventionist government, probably more interventionist than I would have ever have advocated for as a Conservative. So I think when I think specifically around levelling up, I think what excites me about the white paper is it says government's going to be it's going to work really cross government, because as a council we function very outcome focused. So when I talk about knowing if someone's got a home, a friend and a job and they're in a stable environment, I can tell whether that is effective and that intervention is happening effectively across my place. Government is big and not always effective when it comes to making really direct decisions to people who live in the country. You can trot out the 23 ministerial departments, the 20 non-ministerial departments, and the endless quangos that have been funded that still try to make an impact, I guess, on people's lives. But it doesn't alter the fact that they're not able to make the same level of intervention or impact that we do in local government. I think a reconnect and focus around outcome is an important element of how we need to seize levelling up as an opportunity for us to connect with people. And that means not thinking about the impact the department would have, but thinking about the impact on the individual along those key life determinants that I talked about earlier. And I absolutely support the view that I know that Robert and Damian made, which was around how we make sure that business picks up their social responsibility here, but also they get to see some of the opportunities that can come if you get strong leaders in local areas to connect with, proper regeneration schemes that do things that you can't do purely on a market-led perspective. Sometimes it's about realising a site that would never be reclaimed unless it had an intervention. It might be about building some infrastructure around some specialists, as we're looking to do an advanced manufacturing park to create better paid jobs that people connect with some of those skills and opportunities that could come their way. And also it's about encouraging, particularly, especially around devolution, all those things that are planned centrally in local government that frankly don't provide local fixes. And one of those schemes for me is really about how we use DWP, which was a very centrist approach to connect people to places, to jobs, to opportunity, when frankly local labour markets could do that far better and could secure a better future for individuals that live in the community. So I think, just to sum up, I think levelling up is a really positive thing. I won't have anybody tell me that this government hasn't spent an awful lot of money to transform people's lives, particularly in the north of the country, because they have, and they are starting to make a difference. But not all of those things are placed regeneration initiatives. We've got to think of people, and we've got to think about how we transform people's lives, not from a big system perspective, but from a very focused outcome perspective that we can see tangibly that the difference has been made, not just because we keep people down with intervention, but we enable them to grow up, to get into work, to see some of those true opportunities that can come from having a home, a friend and a job. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Very, very thoughtful perspective. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to bring in questions. Got loads of questions coming through. Just to remind people, you can ask questions through Slido, the link of which is below the YouTube screen that you're watching. And I'm going to ask a series of questions now from different people and direct them to one of the speakers. And if the speakers could keep their answers relatively short, that would be great as well. So firstly, we have a journalist from PA, Chris McCown, who's asking a question specifically for Damian. How should the government prevent new housing falling into the hands of large rental companies? I'm going to ask a series more, Damian, but I'll come back to you in a second. The second question I have is from Adam Friedman from the Chartered Management Institute, who asks, what is the role of skills in driving successful levelling up? Is the government considering skills seriously enough in its levelling up agenda? Anushka touched on this a bit, but maybe I can come to Robert for his thoughts on skills a little bit more. I have Gail Teasdale from Broadacres Housing Association, asking, in North Yorkshire, the lack of affordable homes means workers cannot live in the area. This directly contributes to the 18% productivity gap. How do we resolve this? As a fellow Yorkshire person, Anushka, I might ask you to answer that. You are from Yorkshire originally, aren't you? No, gosh, sorry, apologies. But I'll let you answer it anyway on the productivity gap. And then Jane Ashcroft from Anchor, Damian flagged intergenerational challenges in housing. Would enabling retirement housing downsizing market of all tenures to flourish support levelling up? Damian's touched on that, so I may ask Rob and Angela to come in on that one. So Damian, if you go first.
I mean, if you want brief answers, you can either use financial mechanisms, you can alter the tax system so that if something is sold for ownership, basically, it has tax advantages, so to discourage people from doing what they do at the moment. Or you could make it a planning condition, which would be a more absolutist way of doing it. But there are various levers at government's disposal which they could use to actively and specifically promote home ownership of new homes.
Great, thanks, Damian. Robert, perhaps on the skills question, you might want to come in.
Well, I think the government has basically got the right agenda, hasn't it? Which is to try to create a set of vocational and technical standards which parents and employers can have real confidence in, and raise the stature of those. T-levels and graduate apprenticeships are the two most important. It's a long journey. They're only just being rolled out really across the country, and it's going to take a generation before I think parents have sufficient confidence in those qualifications to see that it's something that they want, you know, if they're aspirational families, their children to have. Because, you know, my generation growing up in the 90s was fed remorselessly the story that you have to go to university, which is, you know, neither of my parents went to university. My sister and I were the first to go, but the majority of our friends went to university, and so that culture has to be changed, and that's going to take some time to unwind. But I think the government's broadly doing that. I think trying to get more good employers to take apprenticeships on is important. Breaking into the professions so that it's a perfectly viable route to go into law or accountancy or whatever it might be via a graduate apprenticeship, or rather than simply having to go to university in the normal way, will make a difference. But I do think the big issue here is the regional educational disparities, and they are still very pronounced in this country, and there has to be a really relentless focus on that. And as some other speakers have said, I don't think the government's got that right yet. There's been some initiatives like sort of opportunity zones and so on, but there's got to be a focus on that, rather like the last Labour government did successfully in London. We've got to bring that to the sorts of places that I represent, where educational standards lag far behind some other parts of the country. And that isn't simply about money, it's about attracting the right teachers, getting the right structures in place, and having a really serious focus on it.
Anushka, not from Yorkshire, this issue around the people being priced out of certain areas and this contributing to a lack of the productivity gap. But, you know, some people may argue, actually, if certain areas like London become more expensive, it may mean that actually people look in different places and talent and skills goes to those places. So what's the sort of balance?
I was going to say, there's sort of, I mean, I'm not sure I'm the expert on this in a way, but there's two issues, right? There's an issue if you're in an area which doesn't have loads of investment and doesn't have the opportunities that you might want to, you know, remain in that area. But there's an issue if you live in a place like London, or I presume like, you know, York or Harrogate, that are particularly expensive, that you're facing massive costs. So you can have the same job perhaps as someone somewhere else, but it's just much more expensive to live there. It feels to me like one of the answers to this is to make it much easier to live and work and have opportunities wherever you are. And that means not just in I might even, I don't know if York is, Harrogate probably isn't in North Yorkshire. York, I think, is. But, you know, not only in York, but in all the surrounding areas. And on this, although I think Labour are not totally in agreement on this, by the way, I think there are some in the Labour side who think pour the money into the cities and then the money kind of feeds out from the cities. And then there's Lisa Nandy, who is very, very passionate about focusing in on towns and on localities and trying to make sure that the funding doesn't just all suck into the areas that are the hardest to live in, like, for example, York. And you know, for all we talk about levelling up, a number of people on here who are from the south have talked about the pockets of deprivation in the south. Similarly, the north and the Midlands have the same mix and the same challenges. And in a way, some of the stuff around the train stuff, which was positive, the integrated rail review, was that they focused a bit less on getting everybody from, you know, Leeds to Birmingham, and a little bit more on getting people much more locally around these areas so that they can live in an affordable area and still have the opportunities for the same jobs.
Angela, did you want to come in on this issue around retirement housing and the downsizing market? I don't know if that's something you wanted to come in on.
Yeah, I'm happy to add my voice, although I suggest that the person who asked the question knows more than I do about this. But I mean, how do we encourage homeowners, older people who are living in their own home, to downsize? Well, the only way you can do that is to offer them something attractive to downsize into, in an area where they want to live and in a type of accommodation that suits their needs. And the truth of the matter is that we're not building enough of that kind of accommodation because there's no national strategy to do this, there's no regional strategy to do this, and there's no onus on the builders to do this. So until we try and align those two competing issues together, we're not going to get that flow through. Of course, it makes sense from a pragmatist's perspective, but actually, you know, a lot of older owner occupiers see their home as an investment for their children as well. So we've got a cultural issue as well as a lack of supply issue of the right type of housing to encourage people to move into. I mean, I can't remember the last time that we built, even in the Northeast, where we've got a bit of land, big bungalows for sale. I mean, because it's land hungry and the house builders don't want to do that. So we've got an issue here. Let's start building what people might want to move into and let's see if it works, I would say.
Great. I'm just going to bring in three final questions, and Rob and Alex, you'll have first dibs on those. So the first question is from Ian Fletcher, who asks, how to ensure that levelling up is not just for core cities, but supports the smaller towns and cities that find it harder to attract private investment? I might come to you, Rob, for that one. A question from Joe Mitchell from the Public Interest News Foundation, who says, if levelling up isn't just economic but cultural, what are the best policies to bring about pride in place? So Alex, you might want to speak to that. And then the final question, which is for everybody, is, can the panel all answer in a single sentence what they interpret levelling up to actually mean? So Rob, do you want to go first?
Yeah, well, I think you've just got to build strong places around whatever the intervention looks like. I think, you know, Towndale was a really good example. I think, you know, we can't leave it city-centric and just assume that everything will trickle out. It doesn't work like that. And I think, again, it's a point that I would make, and you'd expect me to make it around local government. We're closer to this stuff, and you don't need national and regional policies to solve some broken elements of the chain. What you need to do is really strong local policies. So it links back to this, but also to the previous question. Locally, I've got an older people's housing strategy. We've built 200 older people's housing. Yeah, you can do that, but you've got to have strong local leadership to direct that, because that's that's what needs to be fixed. And guess what? If you get good accessible housing in a locality, you reduce your adult social care costs because people don't wait to fall down the stairs. And actually this is an important part generally about regeneration. You've got to have a really close local understanding about what the challenges are and fix them locally.
Great. Alex.
Yeah, just on that question about investing in local social pride. And I think this relates actually to the question about intergenerational housing, or housing in general, but intergenerational relationships as well. So on housing, enabling older people to downsize into high quality homes is important, but enabling them to do it in a way that keeps them interactive with other generations, local businesses, other people who have had different life experiences from them, I think is equally important. So mixed generation housing, I think, is absolutely fundamental, and I don't think anyone's quite cracked that well at this point. And to the specific question, I think the best policy for investing in local social pride is to have schools compelled to have local social history taught by some of the local older people who made it. They can then act not only as teachers, but also as role models and people who hold authority and wisdom and relational strength, not just within the four walls of the school building, but in the wider community in general, and can expand those horizons for younger people.
Great, thanks, Alex. And just this point around institutions that bring people together, I think it's often worth thinking about how children can be a social glue. And when people have children, it means they start to look for services that can help their children. And so thinking about how we can build child-friendly institutions and spaces, and that acting as not only a space for children to come together, but their parents too, and how they build relationships. Okay, so the final question is what, in a single sentence, people interpret levelling up to mean. So let's start with Angela. Single sentence.
Same opportunity for all.
Anushka?
Good enough opportunities that you don't have to move away from where you grew up.
Stay local but go far. Michael Gove conceptualized it as. Alex?
Through relationships.
Damian?
Creating a society where it doesn't matter where you start from, you have an equal opportunity.
Rob?
When I created the MHCLG office in Wolverhampton, I used to say that levelling up meant that a child born in Wolverhampton didn't have to go to Westminster to access all the opportunities this country has.
And then the other Rob?
Opportunity-based investment delivered locally.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for that. That was a really wide-ranging discussion. I think we had lots of people represented, different sectors. The only sector that probably wasn't represented was the private sector, and Robert talked about the importance of that in this whole levelling up mission. So for the next discussion, we must make sure we have that. But thank you all for your contributions, very thoughtful and very grateful for your time. Thank you to everybody who's been watching at home. Thank you to Playersherbers for partnering with us on this event. And a big sort of virtual round of applause to the speakers. Thank you very much and have a good rest of the day.